Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm In-jung North Korea has amended its constitution to include its policy on nuclear force. And as North Korea and Russia step up military cooperation, China prepares to hold a summit with South Korea and Japan. Today we discuss the latest regional dynamics in Northeast Asia.
We reiterate that the DPRK should understand that the only viable path forward is through diplomacy.
To work closely together to make summit possible within this year. I hope that some leaders will do their very best to make this happen.
In the studio with me, Mr. Anthony Ruggiero, Senior Director at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Ruggiero was the National Security Council Senior Director for Counterproliferation and Biodefense during the Trump administration. He was also NSC Director for North Korea. Also joining us, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, Mr. Snyder was the Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Center at the Asia Foundation. Mr. Snyder's latest book is the U.S.-South Korea Alliance, Why It May Fail and Why It Must Not. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Injun.
Thanks for having us.
Now, Mr. Snyder, North Korea has written into its constitution its policy on nuclear force. The prospects for nuclear negotiations with North Korea was already bleak, but how does the latest development further dim the prospects?
Well, I think that North Korea has signaled resolve not to denuclearize. And so it makes the likelihood of any negotiation with the United States on denuclearization much lower. It really makes the conflict between the U.S. and North Korea more intractable than it was before. And I think it also sends a signal of intent not to reunify. And it underscores that North Korea is not planning on moving in the direction of denuclearization anytime soon.
Mr. Ruggiero, the United States in principle is open to dialogue with North Korea. Now that North Korea has put into constitution its nuclear force policy, can the United States continue to demand the same kind of denuclearization that it has demanded for 30 years? Wouldn't the U.S.'s denuclearization demand only be diluted in the future?
Well, I think the first thing is to underscore that it's the UN, the United Nations demand that North Korea denuclearizes. That's been in every resolution really for the history of this conflict with North Korea, unfortunately. I think the prospects in the short term are very slim, as Scott mentioned, very, very slim, unfortunately. But we don't know what will happen over the next 5, 10, 15 years. With the leadership in North Korea and how the U.S. reacts to North Korea's program. I think this underscores why we should not just sit around and not do sanctions against North Korea just because we think denuclearization won't happen. I think that's the best way forward right now.
Do you think then there is a possibility that the negotiation between the United States and North Korea may move towards what North Korea wants, the risk reduction and disarmament?
Well, the danger there, of course, is that if we formally accept North Korea's nuclear program in the sense of doing arms control negotiations, which I know that some people want, what does that mean for South Korea's desire for nuclear weapons? What about Japan? What about Taiwan? What about in the Middle East, Iran, Saudi Arabia? I mean, the list goes on, unfortunately. So this is not simply just an issue that we could just look like in a vacuum with North Korea. It has broader implications if we decided to just accept North Korea's nuclear program in a formal sense.
what reaction should South Korea and United States show to North Korea in reaction to the latest writing of the nuclear policy into the Constitution? Do you think there needs to be more stronger show of force to warn North Korea from doing these kind of things?
My own view is that we've already taken extended deterrence strengthening measures in response to practical actions that North Korea has taken previously. And this is simply a reiteration, a verbal reiteration baked into the Constitution that this is a state that is built on a foundation of its nuclear capabilities. And so I don't necessarily think that there is a direct set of actions. There may be a set of words that we need to provide in order to indicate the unacceptability of that approach.
Mr. Snyder, Chinese President Xi Jinping met with South Korean Premier Han Duck-soo before the opening ceremony of the Hangzhou Asian Games. And earlier in September, President Yoon Suk-yeol met with Chinese Premier Li Chang. Now, Seoul and Beijing are now engaged at the highest level of discussions. Critics have pointed out that because the Yoon government is focusing so much on Japan and the United States, it is deteriorating its relations with China. But now it seems to be the opposite is true. And the Chinese government towards the previous South Korean government, which was more conciliatory, was more assertive and is now reaching out to the Yoon government. What is the key takeaway?
Well, it's pretty clear that South Korea has a better chance of getting what it wants with China if it does it on the platform provided by the U.S.-South Korea alliance. But at the same time, there are a lot of structural difficulties that have emerged in the China-South Korea relationship that pose challenges, I think, for either a progressive or a conservative administration in South Korea. One, public opinion on both sides has deteriorated pretty dramatically. Two, both sides, I think, have different definitions of mutual respect as the main approach to the relationship. And three, it's not clear to me that China can adapt from thinking about South Korea as a peripheral state, a state on its periphery, to the idea of dealing with South Korea as a global pivotal state.
Mr. Ruggiero, last time President Xi Jinping was in South Korea was in 2014, and this time President Xi said he will seriously consider going to South Korea. Now, wouldn't that deal a significant blow to the North Korea-Russia rapprochement?
I'm not sure that it will. North Korea relies on China for its sanctions evasion, for other activities. I mean, for example, the Chinese have anywhere between 20,000 and 100,000 North Korean overseas laborers that the Biden administration says North Korea gets hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue per year from that, just that alone, not to mention the coal trade and other trades. So that relationship is always going to be strong between North Korea and China. I think Scott's right. President Yoon is making the right choice here. Choosing to align with China would be a mistake, given how China treats other countries in the region, and the South Koreans are making the right choice and are coming from more of a position of leverage and strength with regard to China.
Mr. Snyder, Mr. Ruggiero just said that North Korea-China relations will always be strong, but this time, North Korea didn't send a high-level delegation to the Hangzhou Asian Games. Do you think there's some kind of tension between the two? I mean, North Korea always played off China and Russia off against each other.
Well, the issue of the delegation to the Hangzhou Asian Games is just one data point, and I think that we have to look more broadly and see whether there are other data points. And I think the one that people would probably naturally gravitate to is the fact that Kim Jong-un paid a lot more attention to the Russian defense minister than to the high-level Chinese representative back on July 27th, the so-called Victory Day celebrations. And it's certainly the case that I think that Kim Jong-un might like to recreate the kind of dynamic that existed in the Cold War with his grandfather, where his grandfather was able to play off the Soviets and the Chinese against each other. But this is a different time, and I'm not sure that it's going to be possible for some of the reasons that Anthony laid out for that dynamic to be recreated.
Do you think China may have some reservations in getting closer to North Korea and Russia, which are engaged in illegal military cooperation, and especially given that China also has relationship with the United States and South Korea?
I want to look at this through the lens of the U.S. approach to, in particular, the North Korea-Russia summit. Because I think that what we saw there was that the United States used intelligence in order to almost be the spokesperson for that meeting. They got out in front, and they were using a naming and shaming approach. And I think one reason why they used that approach is that it had been effective in delimiting China's support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But of course, Kim Jong-un and Putin have no shame. So it was not possible for a naming and shaming approach to work.
Some say President Xi Jinping met with South Korean Prime Minister Han Duck-soo just to show North Korea that he is upset about Kim's meeting with Putin. And if Xi Jinping returns to South Korea in almost a decade, wouldn't that be a serious blow to North Korea?
Well, I think that's a plausible signal that Xi Jinping was sending. And I think there's a lot that we don't know about the China-North Korea relationship at this particular moment. I mean, only months ago, it seemed like Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping were the best pen pals with each other. And so we really have to wait and see how some of this plays out. In particular, whether or not it's possible for Xi to actually go to Seoul first. I think that would be a significant step. And it makes sense for the U.S. and South Korea to explore with China what can be done as related to North Korea. But we also have to remember that the strategic environment is quite negative in the context of rising Sino-U.S. rivalry. And so even though this one issue has emerged as a potential point of convergence between the U.S. and China, there are a lot of other areas, the broader context suggests that it would be enormously difficult to actually single out this one issue and make progress on it.
And Mr. Ruggiero, in response to the rapprochement between North Korea and Russia, you told me that United States should target North Korea's revenue sources. But didn't the previous administrations and the Congress also came up with similar ideas? How do you propose to tighten the screws on North Korea differently from before?
Right, this is a question of implementation, really. It's one thing to pass a law or to pass a Security Council resolution, and it's another to actually implement them. And right now, unfortunately, sanctions have atrophied, as you noted, since 2018, really going back to the previous administration. And it's really a question when you look at the quantitative, so the numbers that they're doing, but then the qualitative, the types of transactions that they're going after, they're not going after enough. When this administration is going after networks inside of China that are run by North Koreans and saying that they're working with Chinese companies and banks, but they're not going after those Chinese and banks, that shows that they're not serious about going after this. As we talked about earlier about the unlikeliness that we would have denuclearization, this is the time to go after his revenue and make him make a decision between his strategic priorities, nuclear, missile, elites, and military, and helping Putin. That's the way you do it. They're not going to be able to affect two countries that are next to each other transferring items between them, but they can affect Kim's calculus.
So you talk about implementation, then the broad idea is the same as before then, because it was only the matter of implementation. You work from the same premise and same conditions, right?
Well, look, over the last 15, 20 years that we've been working on the North Korea nuclear issue and have had a variety of sanctions imposed against North Korea, we've done more on the negotiation side than we have actually implementing our sanctions. We've really only done that 2016, 2017, and 2018. The perfect example is, in 2017, coal purchases were prohibited by the UN. That has to be implemented. It's not just that the UN makes that decision and then North Korea steps back and says, oh, well, I guess I can't transfer any more coal. What North Korea does is they create front companies, they do ship-to-ship transfers, they have a willing partner in China. And if we don't have the United States really leaning forward and implementing all of these sanctions, because the UN Security Council is essentially ineffective because of Russia and China, then we're in the same situation we were before those 3-year period I noted.
Mr. Snyder, Russian President Vladimir Putin, when he was asked if Russia will help with North Korean satellite technology, he said that's exactly the reason why we're here at the Space Rocket Launch Center. Now, wouldn't it take a long time for Russia to transfer satellite technology, as it did take a long time for it to transfer satellite technology to South Korea? Do you think it can be done easily and in a very short time?
Well, I think there's a distinction between the transfer and the mastery of technology in the North Korean context. I'm not so sure that actually transferring technology itself is going to be, that difficult. But let me step back, because I think the more important issue here is that, in the context of the North Korea-Russia summit, in my view, and as we look at Kim Jong-un visiting all these munition factories, I mean, these are authoritarian leaders. They have control over their communications apparatus. They are signaling what they want to signal. And frankly, I think they're trolling the US and South Korea to some degree, because it's a relationship built on mutual mistrust. Neither leader is going to be able to trust his own people, much less other people. And so how far can they really go in this relationship? I don't think that we should underplay it, but I don't think we should overplay it either. And I think that there was certainly an element of theater as related to what President Putin was signaling with regards to the prospects for the Russia-North Korea relationship.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Ruggiero, except for the 3-year period that you mentioned, sanctions on North Korea has failed under both Republican and Democratic governments. Is it because of the lack of the government's will, or is it because the sanctions policy is fundamentally ineffective?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say again that, through that period, the last 15, 20 years, we've spent more time trying to negotiate with North Korea. And in a lot of those periods, when you look at the numbers,
so it's the lack of will. So it's the lack of will.
Well, I think that's right. Yeah. I mean, certainly sanctions are never 100% foolproof. We're seeing that with Russia, right? We see loopholes, but the difference we're seeing on the united front against Russia is that we're actually trying to close those loopholes. Mm-hmm. We're not doing that with North Korea. We haven't done that since 2018. And really, even before that, we didn't do that. Even as you noted, in the W administration, when he was trying to do negotiations, in the Obama administration, where he essentially ignored North Korea for 7 years, didn't really do sanctions. When you look at those numbers and you look at the quality of those sanctions, they're really much lower than in the 2016, 2017, and 2018 space. And I would say, there's a lot of conversations about the effectiveness of sanctions. Maybe we should have conversations, too, about the effectiveness of our negotiations with North Korea, because that's clearly failed over the last 20, 30 years, too.
So on this issue, I think I might have a slight difference, not necessarily in the direction that Anthony is going in, but I think that we, at this point, do have to step back and recognize that the 2017 UNSC sanctions are no longer implementable because the Security Council is paralyzed. Mm-hmm. And North Korea has implemented its own self-quarantine, which demonstrated, I think, a greater resilience in terms of survivability of sanctions than one might have expected. And so I think that we actually need to step back and do a complete revamp as we think about sanctions, to update in order to make them more effective, and also in order to find new instruments by which to more effectively implement the sanctions regime that need to be addressed because of North Korea's evasion of sanctions. Mm-hmm.
Another success was the BDA, which sent North Korea under jitters. And at the time, there was tensions between State Department, which prioritized diplomacy, and Treasury, which came up with innovative ideas. Do you think there is the inherent tension, even now, between the State Department and the Treasury when it comes to sanctioning North Korea?
I think the message comes from the top, as it did with the previous president and with this president. I mean, I think they certainly put North Korea policy in the broader Asia context, and certainly now it's within the context of the Russia war. I'll just say on the 2016 to 2018 period, I understand that UN sanctions were the primary vehicle, but those were implemented by US sanctions, and that still exists. The bottom line is that there are Chinese banks that are violating U.S. law, just to be clear, U.S. law, and that they risk their access to the U.S. financial system. And when that risk was put at risk in 2016 and 2018, the Chinese chose their access to the U.S. financial system and not North Korea. Now, maybe they will take a different choice. Obviously, the U.S.-China relationship is in a different position. In terms of BDA, that was a very long time ago. I personally think that if we had actually had a sanctions policy through the second term of the W. Bush administration, especially when North Korea was building a nuclear reactor in Syria, covertly and not engaged in negotiations. By the way, we weren't engaged in sanctions after BDA. We were heavily engaged in negotiations that the North Koreans just strung us along and just waited until the next administration. So to me, that's less a failure of sanctions and more a failure of negotiations.
Mr. Ruggiero, if the Treasury were to announce sanctions on Chinese large banks today, what would be the pros and cons?
Well, it's important to keep in mind that it's unlikely that it's large Chinese banks that are doing it. It's probably medium and smaller size banks.
But smaller size banks wouldn't have so much implications on China and North Korea.
They did in 2017 and 2018 when we went after Bank of Dandong and other Chinese financial institutions. This is a question of deterrence, right? So if you go after the smaller parts that are engaged with those networks, the bigger banks take notice because they're the ones who would lose their access to the U.S. financial system if they continued the transactions for North Korea. We're not doing any of that. We're so far away from that. Just to be clear, we're so far away from that. We're not even going after full networks. When we talk about Russia, North Korea, this administration decided to go after an individual in late March and then waited several months, I think it was 4 months, until they went after his companies, which were not newly created. So to me, it suggests that there's not even a strategic look, back to Scott's point, at North Korea sanctions. To me, I argue for full going after everything on North Korea. Put 2 or 3 people at the Treasury Department, maybe a couple people at State, and just go after it. But I acknowledge that's one approach. But I would say we don't even have any approach here. We're just saying, okay, we're going to go after something today so that we can check a box and make it look like we're doing North Korea sanctions. That's unfortunate to me.
And there, I would say that Anthony is very correctly characterizing the level of priority that North Korea has in the overall foreign policy inbox of the Biden administration.
Now, Mr. Snyder, North Korea expelled private second-class Travis King, who crossed the DMZ without authorization. The State Department was clear that this does not herald diplomatic breakthrough with North Korea. Is it because this is not the kind of incident that provides diplomatic opportunity, or does it show U.S.'s skepticism on North Korea, which rejected multiple offers for talks?
Well, I look at this in the context of past U.S. efforts to actually isolate civilian returns from the broader diplomatic environment, going back to former President Clinton and Laura Ling and Una Lee, and then Clapper going back to North Korea in 2015. In most cases, the U.S. has been inclined to separate the humanitarian exchange component from the political component. And I think that what we're seeing is a signal that this is the same.
Mr. Ruggiero, what was North Korea's calculation in releasing Private King? Were there more costs than benefits for North Korea?
Yeah, that's a great question. The one thing I'll also point out is many of us were focused on this when he did run across the DMZ, is what happened internally in the U.S. to allow this to occur, because he was supposed to be on a plane back to the United States for other unrelated incidents in South Korea. So how did this actually occur? So hopefully that doesn't get lost in the process. In terms of North Korea, I'm guessing they initially were interested in a military official going across, someone in the active military going across the DMZ, but then they quickly learned that not only was he very low level, but he had been out of parts of the service because of his other incidents in South Korea for quite some time, and there was probably no value for the North Koreans, and that's why we saw, as Scott said, sort of an offshoot of the tense relationship between the two countries. And thankfully, we have other countries that can act on our behalf, the U.S. behalf, and we're able to do that inside of China.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Ruggiero, Mr. Snyder, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.